we'll get going. It is a slightly, there is a lot of ground to cover. So what I will do is I will sort of go about talking about broad principles. Really, I'm not going to go, into too much of technical details. The brief I was given was basically there should be enough material that that people can write questions, answer questions that are asked in the examination. Some of those questions were sent to me. A lot of that will be covered in the talk, and a couple of other issues that are there that are left, I will take it at the end because they are not directly in context to this talk. Uh, so the brief essentially was to talk about organ transplantation in children, and questions that seem to come over the years in the examination include liver, kidney. There are a couple of instances where people have asked about intestinal transplant and lung transplant, more to do with current status and current situation, etc. So I will focus. There are questions on immunosuppression. There are questions on sorted complications of transplant, etc. So I will just cover all this ground briefly, and if there are any specific questions that we can take it to the end at the end. Now, I am not very sure if this the WebEx itself has a time cap, and if it is, what is that time cap?
Sanjay, what we'll do is in case, it has a time cap indeed. I think it is 50 minutes, but no problem.
Okay.
In case abruptly cuts, we will rejoin. That's our Indian jugaad.
Okay. All right. Okay. Fine.
So,
So that will settle. Let's.
Again. Okay.
All right. All right. So solid organ transplantation in children. This is essentially a primer. So rather than talk about each organ separately to start with, I will go and discuss a few brief principles that are common to all transplantation, regarding the immunology, regarding the donors, all those kind of things. And then we'll come down briefly to organs. I will concentrate a little bit on the liver and kidney, and then touch briefly on lung and intestine and multi-organ vessel. All right. So before we start, I think there are certain basic facts that we need to know. In transplantation, immunology is king. Every other thing that we can do, every other issue that is there is potentially solvable, and there has been significant improvement. But the key issue about long-term outcomes is to do with immunology. And I think that is something that we still do not clearly understand. We are barely tinkering at the periphery, and that's the reason why we are having issues over the long term. So the biggest barrier to transplantation is immunological, because our body over millennia has evolved a mechanism for self-preservation, wherein our cells, our immune system recognizes what is us and what is not us. So it recognizes self and non-self, and that is a fundamental of our immune system, which is vital for our survival in the environment. So the main actors of this, as far as transplantation is concerned, which helps recognize the self and non-self, is what is called the major histocompatibility complex. In humans, it is called the HLA, or human leukocyte antigen system. And this is a group of antigens which are very specific. So they are species specific. That means they recognize different species. So they are allo specific, and they are also individual specific. So they are like fingerprints, and they are auto specific. So they could be allo specific, that means specific at species level, and auto specific within the species, specific to the individual. And this is what helps us recognize what is our tissue and what is transplanted tissue. So the human leukocyte antigen system is coded by a set of genes that is present on chromosome 6. There is great heterogeneity. So from that coding to the actual action, there are a lot of gaps that we do not understand. So it provides a very unique protein signature for each individual species and each individual organism within the human species. So it's a very, very complex system. You can just imagine the number of permutations and combinations that can exist. We inherit one allele from each parent, as with all chromosomes, and they are co-dominant in expression. That means both the genes express they are antigens, they are proteins. So it is not a dominant or recessive, they are co-dominant, and that's the reason why there is so much of heterogeneity. So this is a barrier to to transplantation, because our body seems to recognize tissues that do not belong to us. And immune suppression is the science or the strategy or the technology that is used to overcome this barrier. So every patient who has organ transplantation will require immunosuppression. Of that, there is no doubt whatsoever. So this is the HLA system in brief. This reference, which is here, Mackay Rosen, New England Journal of Medicine in 2007, is a very, very nice article. So those of you who are interested should read it, because it covers a lot of this ground, and it describes it in words that we can understand easily. So the reference is there. So essentially, there are two systems. The one what is called the class 1 antigens, which are where we are familiar with, HLA A, B, C. So these are expressed on all nucleated cells, and they are recognized by CD8, which is basically the cytotoxic T lymphocytes. So this is universal. This is on all cells. Similarly, there is a class 2 set of antigens that are called HLA DR, DP, DQ. So these are expressed only in the antigen presenting cells. The antigen presenting cells are complex cells that are present all over our body. Classical example are the dendritic cells. These are cells that are present all over our body, and they are the first responders. So anytime there is a virus or a bacteria that enters our system, the antigen presenting cell takes inside by vacuolation. It breaks it down, analyzes the protein signature of that particular organism, and it identifies proteins that are unique to that organism, then takes that protein and presents it on its cell membrane as beacons, and these beacons attract other lymphocytes to come there and set off the cascade. So these are antigen presenting cells. So the class 2 are expressed only on antigen presenting cells, and this HLA-DR is thought to be important in the occurrence of rejection. So these antigens are usually recognized by the CD4 or the helper T lymphocytes. So this is broadly how the HLA system works. I mean, there are many nuances and there are many variations. Now the class 3 the HLA system is also becoming important, because as we overcome the barriers of short-term survival and medium-term survival, and patients are surviving longer and longer on transplanted organs, we see that these organs are slowly, there is a fire, there is an inflammation that goes on in these organs, and we are trying to see what it is that causes this inflammation. So we can suppress T lymphocytes, we can suppress B lymphocytes, but even when you do all that, continued inflammation is there, and that's the reason why all these things are now getting interest and getting people to look at them. The other reason why these are important is a lot of these are target for various drugs of immunosuppression. This is in brief an HLA system, and I would strongly recommend those of you who are interested to go through this article. It's very, very nicely written. Now, any organ which is transplanted is attacked by the host immune system in the absence of immunosuppression, and that is called rejection. So it is basically an immune-mediated damage to the graft organ. So rejection and the medication to prevent the rejection is the cause of majority of long-term complications in transplantation, irrespective of the organ, more than the technical issues. The technical issues with surgery, how to anastomose a particular artery and how to anastomose the bronchus and how to reconstruct the bile ducts, all those are technical issues that have all been crossed. But the outcomes now are determined largely by rejection and by side effects of drugs that we give to combat rejection. So this is something that we cannot get away from, and hence it is very important now. So the whole focus of transplantation has now shifted towards management and understanding of rejection and its treatment. So rejection can be of three types. It could be hyperacute, acute, or chronic. These are things that we are familiar with, but it's just worth going through because you are having questions on rejection. So hyperacute rejection, usually the typical example of hyperacute rejection is you implant the kidney. The patient has pre-circulating antibodies. The donor has been exposed to similar antigens in the past, either through a blood transfusion or through a previous transplantation or through some other means. So he has antibodies already circulating in his blood. So once the graft is put and the graft is perfused, these preformed antibodies immediately go into the organ and they attach themselves to the blood vessels and they cause intravenous thrombosis and interstitial hemorrhage. And this is dramatic. This is something you see on the table. It is something that Moment you unclamp and you perfuse the organ, within a matter of minutes, the organ changes color, becomes blue, becomes turgid, becomes edematous, and can actually rupture because of edema. So this is a hyperacute rejection. This used to be very common when transplantation started in the 60s and the 70s. But over time, as immune suppression protocols have evolved, as priming or as induction has come into picture, as better understanding with HLA matching has come into picture, as different drugs have come, hyperacute rejection becomes less and less. But it is still seen, and when it happens, it is quite a disaster because you just have to take out that organ and there's really no salvage. The next, which is more common, is the acute rejection. And this acute rejection usually happens over the first 6 months to 1 year. Theoretically, it can happen at any time, but by far it is most common during this time, around 6 months to 1 year. The commonest cause for that is a T cell mediated. So it is cell mediated, T cell mediated. Occasionally, it could also be antibody mediated, especially in the kidney. You could have a combination of both or one or the other. Now, this is because of of antibodies and immunological response formed after exposure to the organ. So it takes a little time. And it is characterized by cellular infiltration on the graft. So all this is diagnosed on biopsy. So you have cellular infiltration in the graft, in the parenchyma, for example, in the glomeruli and in the interstitium, you have inflammatory cell infiltrates, and that's how you diagnose acute rejection. Acute rejection usually responds well to treatment, especially in liver, it responds very well. In other organs, maybe not as well, but it is something that can be treated with increasing the levels of immunosuppression and optimizing immunosuppression. So this is a treatable problem. Chronic rejection is something, as the term suggests, happens later on and it happens over long periods of time. It is a slow, indolent process that leads to graft loss over a long period of time. And this is by far the commonest cause of graft failure after transplantation, be it the liver, be it the lung, be it the kidney. Over time, for example, typically in the lung, for example, the bronchi keep getting burnt out and you get bronchiolitis obliterans. Similarly, in the liver, you might have loss of bile ducts. So over time, you have loss of tissue and it is replaced by fibrosis. And it is thought that antibodies play an important role in this over a long period of time. But again, nobody really understands how chronic rejection occurs and what we can do to prevent chronic rejection in the long run. So this is something that currently is the bugbear of all transplantation. Immunosuppression, as I told you, is the intervention that is used to combat rejection, to prevent rejection. So it uses various medications and various therapies to reduce the risk of rejection. So initial immunosuppression is predominantly focused on T cells because we know that most of the acute rejection happens because of T cell reaction, and hence immunosuppression is focused on T cells. By suppressing T cells and by suppressing helper T cells, indirectly it also affects the B cells. And so you get pan immunosuppression, though it is focused more on T cell reactions. So the various drugs that are currently used are calcineurin inhibitors. So tacrolimus is by far the most commonly used immunosuppression agent today across organs, irrespective of which organ we are using. And advent of cyclosporin and tacrolimus in the 70s and 80s, tacrolimus little in the 90s, really changed the face of transplantation and made it a lot more successful endeavor than what it used to be in the 70s and the 80s. So this has probably been the single largest contributor to good early outcomes after transplantation. Antimetabolites like azathioprine, mycophenolate are also commonly used. All these that I've highlighted in yellow is the one that we commonly use. Corticosteroids have always remained the bedrock of immunosuppression protocols, though by itself, especially in children, it can lead to a lot of side effects. So the focus in most transplantation is to try and minimize or completely exclude corticosteroids in the long term. Early transplantation, almost every organ transplantation receives corticosteroids in pretty large doses. Newer agents such as mTOR inhibitors, which is rapamycin, called sirolimus, now these are agents that are not as toxic as calcineurin inhibitors and over a long term have thought to have some beneficial effects. So probably when you're looking at immunosuppression over years and years and years, these are drugs probably that will have more and more use as time passes. It is one thing, it is important to understand that immunosuppressing an adult at the age of 30, 40, 50, when their immune system is mature and they have another 10, 20, 30 years of life is one thing. But to start immunosuppression in an infant who is less than a year or two, whose immune system is not fully developed, we are starting to fiddle with the immune system at that age, and then this child has to live for another 40, 50, 60 years. It is a completely different ballgame, and we still do not understand a lot of what is going on here. So it is really a thing that we are learning as we are going. And transplantation in children has a completely different level of complexity, both technically as well as from immunosuppression as compared to adults. The other agents that are used are monoclonal antibodies. You can use physical techniques such as plasmapheresis. In the olden days, you used to do splenectomies. So you can use immune absorption to do across the blood group kind of transplantation. So there are various ways that we are doing, but the ones that are highlighted in yellow are the ones that are commonly used. Right. So that is about the immune suppression and the immune reaction. The next one that comes is the source of grafts. So for every transplantation, you need a graft. And where is the graft going to come from? The ideal source of graft is a cadaveric donor. So a cadaveric donor is a brain dead donor, and this brain dead donor, the family will is volunteers to donate organs. So various organs can be harvested from this brain dead donor and transplanted into various places. So all this is very well codified in the Indian context in the Transplantation of Human Organs Act, which is a very well written law and has and really codifies all that has to do with transplantation practice within our country. It's one of the very well written laws and very advanced for its time, because when it came in, there was very few countries around the world had laws such as this in place. The problem is in India and most of Asia, the number of cadaveric donations that happen are very few. So when that happens, there are fewer organs that are available for cadaveric donation, especially in children, because most cadaveric donors are adults who meet with road traffic accidents or adults who have intracranial hemorrhages because of strokes and because of ruptured aneurysms, etc. So they are large adults. So for children, having pediatric donors is very rare in our instance. And in our own experience, less than maybe 5% are size match donors, very few. Therefore, the waiting list continues to grow. Various techniques have been used to try and increase the number of patients who can be benefited from a single organ in cadaveric donation. So one of the things to do is to take marginal donors. So even donors who are not ideally suited, maybe donors who have got fatty livers or donors who are more than 70 years of age, donors who have got comorbidities such as diabetes and heart disease, have also been taken as donors. And it has been found that these organs often work better than we imagine that they will. The other technique that came in is to split the organ. For example, you would split the liver, use one adult liver and split it into two. So you use the right lobe in an adult and use the left lobe either in a small adult or a child. So you can benefit two recipients from one cadaveric organ. The other thing that came about is what is called DCD donors, because having brain death donors is a very specific criteria, and not everybody meets brain death criteria. So the other option is to do what is called DCD donor, that is donation after cardiac death. So you wait for cardiorespiratory arrest, and once there is cardiorespiratory arrest, you take the patient to theater, you perfuse the patient and harvest the organ. So here the problem is that you probably will get a larger donor pool, but your ischemia times are going to be longer, and it's a little more cumbersome to organize. But there are several disease donor programs across, donation after cardiac death programs around the world. And these organs too seem to do not much worse than the regular cadaveric or the live donors. The other option when you don't have cadaveric donors is living donor transplants. And this is probably the most large cohort of donors in Asia, in our part of the world. So in India, for example, almost 90% of all transplants across the country are living donor. And the same situation exists in a lot of Asian countries like Hong Kong, China, and Taiwan, and everywhere else. So living donor transplant account for a large number of transplants in India. In children, it is ideally suited, especially in the liver, because you can get the left lateral segment, which includes segment 2 and 3, and that segment is usually useful or adequate for most of the infants and children that we see. So anybody less than 10 kilos, majority of the time, the left lateral segment is ideal. So for the donor, it is a much smaller operation, much less morbidity, much less risk of mortality. And for the recipient, the organ size is about perfect, and hence it is very suited for liver transplantation in small children. Living donor transplantation can also be used for intestinal transplant and for lung transplantation, though these are not common practices. The other concept is what is called ischemia time. So when you cause or clamp the blood vessel to the organ becomes ischemic. So ischemia time is the time from which you clamp or there is circulatory arrest to the time the organ is put into the recipient and the anastomosis is complete and the reperfusion is started. So that is called ischemia time. So from the time of arrest or from the time of start of of circulatory arrest to the time the organ is reperfused within the recipient. So this is called ischemia time. So there are two parts to this. One is the warm ischemia. For example, where the organ is not cooled, but the blood supply has got cut off, like for somebody who has got a donation after cardiac death. So the patient's circulation is arrested, but the organs are still warm. It will take some time for you to get to theater and perfuse it with cold fluid. So you have a relatively long warm ischemia time. From the time the organ is cooled to the time it is reperfused is cold ischemia. So different organs tolerate cold ischemia for different times. And because they tolerate cold ischemia for different times, they can be transported. For example, a heart lung will not tolerate ischemia for more than 3 hours. It gets damaged. Similarly, for pancreas, it is optimally less than 10 hours. For liver, less than 12 hours. Kidney, less than 24 hours. Though theoretically these numbers exist, always the idea is, or the concept and the planning is to reduce the ischemia time as quickly as possible, as short as possible. And that's the reason why you hear about green corridors and you hear about chartered flights and everything to try and reduce the ischemia time of these organs, because the longer the ischemia time, the more the organ is damaged before it is put into place, and more likely that you will have a delayed graft function or a imperfect graft function after the transplantation. So this is ischemia time. So warm ischemia, cold ischemia, and these are the approximate duration that these organs can survive ischemia. All organs before, once they are harvested, are perfused with cold fluid, and this is done to reduce the temperature of these organs. So you reduce the metabolism. So these cells in the organ can withstand some amount of anaerobic metabolism for some time because their metabolic rates and oxygen consumption go down. A lot of these fluid have chelating agents that chelate products of anaerobic metabolism, such as superoxides. They have a balanced electrolyte solution that tries to maintain the homeostasis around these cells when they are in transport. So they allows for transport of organs over long distances. So the ones that are currently used is HTK solution. I'm sorry, this is a typo. HTK solution or University of Wisconsin solution. All of these terms you might have heard. So in principle, they are all the same. And this is what we do to cool the organ and allow it to be taken from one hospital to another hospital. Right. So broadly, for this is still we are still in common with all organ transplants. So what are the factors that determine the outcomes of transplantation in general? And if you have a question that says organ transplant, what are the outcomes in kidney transplant? What determines the outcome in liver transplant? These are more or less the structure of how you have to approach it. So one of the things that matters is the donor factors. So if you have donors from extremes of age, if you have a very elderly donor or a very young donor who's less than 1 or 2 years, your outcomes are poor. If they have pre-existing disease, for example, the liver is fatty. So when you transplant a liver that is fatty, outcomes are not as good. Similarly, if you transplant a kidney from somebody who's a cadaveric donor who had diabetes, that kidney is not going to function properly. You transplant liver in somebody, a lung in somebody who was a smoker, that lung is not going to do as well. So donor factors determine a lot. Similarly, what are the hemodynamic situation of the donor, the cadaveric donor especially? Did he have, after his injury, after his road trauma accident, did he have a long period where he was in shock? Did he require multiple inotropes? Did he require a lot of CPR? Did he require a lot of blood and blood products? So all these influence the injury to the graft and thereabout the outcome in the patient. So donor factors are very important, very, very important. The second factors are related to procurement. As I told you, the most important thing is warm and cold ischemia time. So what is the ischemia time? Is it within what is acceptable for that organ or not? And technical issues during the harvest. So when the harvest was being done, was the harvest being done properly, or was it done in an inappropriate manner where vessels that should have been preserved have been compromised, or tissues that should have been preserved have got damaged, and hence the outcomes are going to be less. So procurement related factors are the second thing. The third thing are recipient related factors. So these could be surgical factors. Your artery got thrombosed, or your vein got thrombosed, or you had a urinary leak, or a bile leak, or a bronchial leak. So these are technical issues which can result in the outcome, which can result in poorer outcome. Pre-existing comorbidity. Suppose you are transplanting a liver into somebody who has got heart disease. Now, that heart disease will not be corrected with liver transplantation. And that heart disease is going to influence the outcome, because when he has heart disease, his liver will not perfuse well. If the liver doesn't perfuse well, it is not going to recover well. So, again, it is going to have a delayed non-function or poorer outcome. So, pre-existing morbidity. In children, for example, when you're transplanting somebody with biliary atresia, suppose this child has hepatopulmonary syndrome, his recovery is going to take much longer. He is going to remain on a ventilator for much longer. And as a result of which, his graft function also is not going to be as good. Suppose somebody has hepatorenal function, hepatorenal failure. So again, kidney function is going to be a problem. So all these pre-existing morbidities will also influence outcome because they are recipient-related factors. But the most important thing that I've put here in capital is immunological factors, as I alluded to earlier. So with modern immunosuppression, we have almost taken away the incidence of hyperacute rejection. Hyperacute rejection today is an extremely rare phenomenon. It does not happen commonly. In the sort of 450, 480 kidneys that we have done, we have seen it happen twice. So it's a very, very, and those two both were patients who have had pre-existing, who have had previous transplantation. So these are very rare occurrences. Acute rejection again is something that is manageable, because with modern immunosuppression therapy, we can predict which patient is going to have acute rejection and take precautions to prevent it, or when it happens, manage it properly. The bugbear is chronic rejection, because we do not understand that process very well. And that is the one that is leading to poorer outcomes in any transplantation over the years. Right. So now we'll go to organ-specific transplantation briefly. So the first organ that we will touch upon was liver transplantation. Again, those of you who like reading, this is a very, very nicely written book. It's called The Puzzle People, and it details Thomas Starzl's journey into transplantation, the technical aspects of that journey, the emotional aspects of the journey, the political issues that one encounters when they are working in a multi-specialty hospital with administration, with other departments. So it's a very, very well-written book. And I think it is something that most of us should read, even if we are not interested in transplantation, simply to highlight, the persistence and the devotion to what they are doing. And it's a very, very motivating book. So the first, liver transplantation was attempted by Starzl in 1963. And again, all his initial patients were children with biliary atresia, because at that time, Kasai was not established in the US, and all patients with biliary atresia would invariably end up with liver failure by the time they were 1 or 2 or 3 years old. So these were his first set of patients. So, and they were all diseased donor transplantations. So somebody died, they took the liver and put it in the child. So the first one was in 1963. After that, that patient died, and then they lost three children on a trot. Three patients all died on table. So they went back to the laboratory, and then they reworked their whole technique, and they came back and then did the first successful one in 1967. And that was incidentally the same year that the first cardiac transplantation was also done. So 1967 is an important year as far as history of transplantation goes. And from then, things have not looked back. Today, liver transplantation is a standard of care for patients with liver failure. In fact, the results have got so good that it is even done for quality of life issues where things are not life threatening. Somebody who's got intense, unremitting pleuritis, for example, or some metabolic problems wherein he is developing stones, for example, in the kidney for oxalosis. So, for these reasons, you can actually do transplantation. However, it is a monumental undertaking for all parties concerned. So it's a big, big, big procedure, and it is something that all of us have to understand. So, what are the indications of liver transplantation in children? And this is something that, again, is a question that is frequently asked. Around the world, as with our own series, more than half or about half the patients are liver failure due to biliary atresia. So, the commonest indication for liver transplantation in children is biliary atresia, by far, 50%. Then you have things like metabolic disease, for example, somebody who's got Wilson's disease, for example. You have patients with familial intrahepatic cholestasis. You have Budd-Chiari syndrome. You have fulminant hepatic failure, who, for example, commonest indication in our country is hepatitis A, resulting in acute liver failure. Hepatoblastoma, certain cases of unresectable hepatoblastoma become an indication. Alagille syndrome, Carelli's disease, so these are indications for liver transplantation. But by far the common ones are biliary atresia, more than half. Metabolic liver disease such as Wilson's disease, which account for another 10 odd percent. PFIC, which are other common reasons for cholestasis in children, Budd-Chiari syndrome, acute hepatic failure, and hepatoblastoma. So these are common. Alagille syndrome is paucity of bile duct. So these are common causes of liver transplantation or indications of liver transplantation around the world. In adults, again, chronic hepatitis is by far the commonest around the world, especially in Asian countries, accounting for more than a third. And this is because of hepatitis C. Alcoholic cirrhosis, primary biliary cirrhosis, etc., are other indications for liver transplantation in adults. Now, sometimes the liver transplantation has to be done in an emergency, and that is what you call a fulminant hepatic failure, wherein if you diagnose somebody with fulminant hepatic failure, they are likely to die within 48 to 72 hours. And that is the reason why you perform an emergency liver transplantation. In the West, the commonest cause for that is paracetamol toxicity. For some reason, we don't see it in our population so commonly. So, for us, the most common indication for fulminant hepatic failure is hepatitis A. Occasionally, it could be drug-induced liver injury. For example, patients who are on, anticonvulsants, patients who are on anti-TB treatment, or some indigenous medicines, acute liver failure. That is country are basically poisoning from rat poisoning, etc. These people have transplanted, especially in Kerala, and things these seem to be quite common. And these, they help. They are indications for organ transplantation. Commonly in children, when you have hepatic artery thrombosis after a transplant, so you do a transplant within the first 8-10 days, the artery gets thrombosed, then that becomes an indication for an emergency retransplantation. Similarly, if you have acute portal vein thrombosis, with the thrombus involving the intrahepatic portal vein as well. Primary non-function, you transplant the liver, but for some reason it just doesn't work, and the patient continues to have progressive liver failure. So these are indications for emergency retransplantation. We discussed about source of organs, so I'm not going to go here again. Again, we discussed about how to increase the donor pool. So we talked about extended criteria, we talked about splitting, we talked about donation, etc. And then comes live donor transplant. Now, the principle of live donor transplantation is based on Koenos segments, and we know that each of these segments has its own dedicated arterial supply, portal supply, biliary drainage, and venous drainage. So theoretically, you could harvest a segment or two, and it will come with its own vasculature, its own biliary supply, and you can then transplant this into a patient. So the commonest thing that we use in children is what is called a left lateral segment, which is usually segment 2 and 3, and it comes with its own artery, vein, portal vein, and its hepatic vein. So you join it at the left hepatic vein junction. In a slightly bigger child or in an adolescent, you can use a full left lobe. That means segment 2, 3, 4. In an adult, they will usually use the right side, which is 5, 6, 7, 8, and leave the middle hepatic vein on this side, and then use the 5, 6, 7, 8. In some countries, they actually go even more and take out 5, 6, 7, 8, and 1 and 4. So these are very, very aggressive resections, and they put the donor at significant risk. So these are things that we have to be very careful about. But the standard graft is a left lateral segment, 2 or 3, a left lobe, which is 2, 3, 4, or a right lobe, which is 5, 6, 7, 8. So these are the standard anatomical grafts that you can use when you are doing live donor transplant. And the same thing you can do when you split an organ in cadaveric transplantation. So what is the advantage? So when you use a cadaveric organ, you get a full organ, and there is no donor risk because that patient is going to die. But the disadvantage is often the donor is unhealthy. Logistics is very difficult. And in country like ours, there are very, very few cadaveric donations that happen. Live donor, you get a healthy organ, but there's a healthy individual who has to undergo major surgery. On the whole, immediate surgical outcomes are marginally better in living donors, but long-term outcomes are not really that different whether it is a live donor or a cadaveric. So preoperative preparations, like any other operation, involves optimizing the health. Liver failure is a systemic disease. It affects assorted organ systems in the body, and each of these have to be optimized before we can go. So you correct infection, you correct nutrition, you give all the immunization, you optimize respiration, optimize renal function, you assess the anatomy, and then you go ahead with transplantation. As I told you, in our practice, about 10% of the donors are cadaveric, and the remaining are all living donor. Again, I told you the various types of grafts that are used. For pediatrics, almost 90% of them are left lateral segments grafts. So in the steps of transplantation procedure itself, you have 3 steps. So you have the anesthetic preparation. Then you start the operation with a big incision in the abdomen, in the upper abdomen. So the first step is to basically explant the native liver. The next step is what is called the anhepatic phase. The next is when you put the new liver and complete the anastomosis, and then you reperfuse. So there is a 3-stage process. So each stage has its own challenges. So so we will come to that. So the basic schema is like this. So when you're doing a full transplantation, you have the IVC to IVC, you have the portal vein, hepatic artery, and bile duct. So this is the normal schema of a full liver transplantation. So the native hepatectomy can be a very major procedure because these patients are coagulopathic. There is often portal hypertension. The livers are terrible. They have had previous Kasais or previous operations. So there's a lot of adhesion. Each adhesion is full of portal hypertension vessels. So the native hepatectomy is a very brutal operation, and it takes probably 70% of the time of the total transplantation. And it's a time where you can have a lot of blood loss, and you have to go carefully and make sure that you limit all these things at that time. Idea is to mobilize the liver completely, isolate the IVC above and below the liver, and isolate the hepatic artery and the portal vein. As you can see, the red slope on the hepatic artery with its branches, and the blue is on the portal vein, and you can dissect that into the liver to get the right and left branch. Once that is done, the liver is taken out. So what you have left here is the IVC. So this big clamp is on the upper part of the IVC. This clamp is on the lower part of the IVC. So this segment of IVC that is retrohepatic is isolated. Then here you have the portal vein and the hepatic artery. And then you have the hepatic veins on the top. So the idea is to join the left hepatic vein of the graft to the hepatic vein inflow, and then join the portal vein and then join the hepatic artery. So this is the anhepatic phase. So during this time, usually the bleeding stops because by the time the anesthetists have given the corrections, given the corrective factors, and corrected the clotting, you catch up with all the fluid and losses that have happened, and let the baby stabilize. Once that is done, at the same time the organ is being harvested. On the bench it is prepared. When you say preparing, what you do is you perfuse again, wash out all the blood, you prepare the blood vessels, you isolate the blood vessels properly, define all these blood vessels properly. Sometimes you might have 2 hepatic veins coming, so you join them together so you have one outflow. This is the portal vein, so you ligate all the branches that are there and make it ready to go and put it into the patient without too much ado. So you start with the hepatic vein anastomosis. So the IVC clamp remains. So the hepatic vein of the liver is joined to the hepatic vein of the patient. You then do a portal venous anastomosis, which is end to end. The left lobe, when it is taken, is usually kept in the normal position of the left lobe. So it is orthotopic. It sits where the normal left lobe would be. So all this repair is usually just to the right of the midline. Once that is done, then you unclamp. You take off the portal vein and you call what is called the neohepatic phase. So portal flow rushes into the liver and into the IVC. So the portal vein now is perfusing the liver. And with that, a lot of the anoxic blood that is clamped behind the portal vein enters the systemic circulation. So you can have some hemodynamic instability, hypothermia, etc. So the anesthetist will control all this. If you have bleeding from the cut surface, all that has to be controlled during this time. So once you have got good control of the patient and the blood vessels and the bleeding, etc., then you go ahead and do the arterial anastomosis. And the arterial anastomosis, here we get help with our microvascular surgeons, and they do it under a microscope. Once that is done, you then do the biliary anastomosis, which is a typical, biliary anastomosis that you would do basically to the side loop of the jejunum with interrupted sutures. We use 5/0 or 6/0 maximum, and that sort of does your transplantation. You can put drains and you come out. So generally, over the next 2 or 3 days, you can see liver function. So the best indications are a stable glucose. You sort of have euglycemia. You don't get hypoglycemia. Your electrolytes get better. Your acid base gets better. Your lactate gets better. And over time, the liver function gets better. The liver function to stabilize will take 5 to 7 days. But signs of early graft function, like good sugar levels, improving lactates, all that indicate good output, indicate that your liver is working. So usually these patients are in the ICU for about 7 to 10 days, and then they can go home. We start immunosuppression immediately at that time. The first dose of immunosuppression is given as soon as the patient is shifted to the ICU. Steroid is given at the time of reperfusion. So from that time onwards, the immunosuppression is started. We do Dopplers on a daily basis to make sure that the vessels are open and the liver is working fine. Like any procedure, especially when you do variant grafts in small children, when you do these kind of grafts, you do have complications. So the black is our sort of range of complications, and the red is what is reported in literature. So you do have a significant incidence of complications of various types in live donor transplantation, especially left lateral segment. But a lot of these are correctable, and a lot of these can get corrected with operation. So overall outcome, the operator survival today is about 95%. 1 year survival is about 80-85%, and the long-term survival in most papers around the world is about 70 to 75%. I say long-term, it means 5 to 7, 10 years. That is the general outcome, and that fall in outcome over time is because of chronic graft injury or chronic rejection that we do not completely understand. But most children with a successful liver transplant have normal quality of life and do whatever their age-appropriate peers are doing. So now we have come. Now we are coming to renal transplantation. Now, the indications for renal transplantation obviously is end-stage renal disease that is not responding to medical care. All right. So usually CKD stage 5 or 6, when your GFR is less than 15 ml per kg per 1.76 millimeter square, etc. In addition to that, if you have progressive growth failure, your GFR itself is not that poor, but you're having progressive growth failure, or the child has got severe renal osteodystrophy, developing severe rickets, or the child has developmental delay, or there is inability to maintain dialysis for various reasons, basically recurrent infections or whatever other social reasons, these would also become indications for renal transplantation, even if you are not fitting that 15 mil per kg GFR criteria. So these are the basic triggers for renal transplantation, I would say, rather than indications. So if you have to look for indications itself, the commonest surgical cause of renal failure requiring renal transplantation is posterolateral valves. So if you look at data, about 30% of or about 50% of all renal transplantation in children are done for surgical causes, maybe a little more than 50%. Of them, posterolateral valve is by far the most common. You could have other causes of bladder obstruction. You could have bilateral renal dysplasias. You could have reflux nephropathy because of recurrent pyelonephritis. You could have renal failure because of neurogenic bladders that have been poorly managed. Or you could have polycystic kidney disease, autosomal recessive polycystic kidney disease. These are the surgical causes. About slightly less than a half would be medical causes, and these are usually globulopathies for various reasons. So these are the common indications for renal transplantation in children. As I told you, most children will require renal transplantation when the GFR is less than 15 mil per kg. All right, they will require renal replacement. The renal replacement could ideally be dialysis, either peritoneal or hemodialysis, or renal transplantation. Now, this is interesting because if you look at this graph tells you the outcomes and survival after renal transplantation based on the amount of time these children have had dialysis before the transplantation. So, if you have a child with renal failure and you don't transplant, a lot of them will die. You know, if you give dialysis for 12 to 23 months, that means for 2 years of dialysis, the outcomes are poorer. 1 year of dialysis, the outcomes are better. No dialysis, so what is called preemptive transplantation, the outcomes are best. So, in other words, the lesser the time your patient spends on dialysis before transplantation, the better the outcomes. All right. So, as far as possible, renal transplantation should be done early. If you keep waiting on dialysis for months and months and years, your outcome is going to be proportionally less because of complications arising from dialysis and infections and sepsis and some metabolic parameters that change we do not clearly understand. But this is a set of data that has been repeatedly demonstrated from around the world, especially in children and even in young adults. So as far as possible, you must transplant early rather than continue on dialysis for long durations of time. In an adult population, the 1 year mortality while on dialysis is almost 30%, 40%. So 3 patients in 10 will die in the first year while on dialysis. So as far as possible, transplant early for better outcomes. The thing that interests us is renal transplant in patients with lower urinary tract anomalies. Again, there is much controversy, but now I think based on whatever data is available, we can conclude that we should establish safe storage and unobstructed drainage before renal transplant, before you transplant. But you should not do the bladder work and then not transplant. So once you are sure that you're proceeding to transplant, a few weeks before the transplant, you do whatever you need to do to the bladder. You augment the bladder, you put a metrophenol, whatever it is that you need to do, and then proceed with transplantation. So careful assessment of the urinary tract is very, very essential. All major reconstructions, for example, augmentation, metrophenol, bladder neck repairs, etc., should all be done before the transplant. CIC, if required, must be established pre-op if possible. The usual thing is most of the patients who are transplanted for surgical problems, for example, for posterior retroviral valves or whatever, they are not anuric. And because they are not anuric, they are continuing to make urine. So because of that, doing an augmentation, doing CIC, all that is much easier than performing it on somebody who is anuric and not making urine at all. So the adult story is different because most of their patients have medical disease and they are they are oligouric or anuric. In children, majority of the children are making good amounts of urine. And that's the reason why it is safe to do an augment and to do all this because the bladder is not dry. Native nephrectomies in children are not generally required. You only do them if it is a proven focus of infection. You know that one particular kidney is pyelonephritic, it keeps getting infected, then you probably go and take it out. If you have severe proteinuria from, it might be an indication to do a nephrectomy. But as far as possible, you try not to do nephrectomies in children because managing an anephric patient is very, very challenging. So you might have dialysis, but if you give 10% more fluid, these patients will go into failure. You give 10% less fluid, they go into hemodynamic, they go into hypotensive shock. So managing an anephric patient is very, very challenging. So that's why in children, usually you do not perform nephrectomies unless there are very, very specific indications. Now today the donor nephrectomy is done by laparoscope. So as you can see, this is the exposure of the hilum. So you are very far away from the kidney. So this is the aorta. This is the renal artery that is coming off from the aorta. And in this patient, the renal vein actually is double. So you have one top vein and one bottom vein that is going down and joining the IVC at two different levels. So it gives you a tremendous exposure and tremendous length of vessels. When this operation is done, the donor nephrectomy is done laparoscopically. Now this same thing. So the kidney is being perfused. You can see the artery being perfused. It's a very nice arterial wall. And this is the vein, the two veins that we saw that have to be prepared. These could either be joint or they could be put in separately. In this instance, we decided to put them in separately. As you can see, these are the two veins now which are being joined. So this is the one vein and this is the other vein that is joined to the common iliac and the external iliac vein. So this is the venous anastomosis that is done first. The kidney is not kept in an orthotopic position. It is kept in an outside position low in the right lower abdomen and it is joined to the common iliac vessels generally. In smaller children, you go up and up. So in a small baby or a small child when you transplant, you might actually join these veins to the IVC and the aorta rather than in the iliac vessels. But in an older child, usually it is the common iliac vein, the external iliac vein. So this is the venous anastomosis. Once the venous anastomosis is done, then you do the arterial anastomosis. So here you can see the artery being joined end to side to the common iliac artery. And it has been perfused. The kidney is nice and pink. The ureter has been pulled down below the cord structures and it is going to be anastomosed to the bladder here in an extravesical ureteric anastomosis. We usually keep a double J stent which is taken out about a week after the transplantation. Now, renal transplantation outcomes are not as good as liver transplantation, partly because the liver itself is a privileged organ. For some reason, it is immunologically better tolerated by the host's body, and also the liver has a unique ability to regenerate. Because of that, the long-term outcomes with liver are far better than most other organs. In liver transplantation, the average lifespan of a transplanted kidney is about 13 years. So by about 13 years, about 50% of the kidneys have uh, lost function. However, patient survival is definitely much better because a lot of these patients receive a second transplant and a third transplant. So that is the reason why the outcomes in graft terms are poorer than patient does. So patients always survive longer because they can go back to dialysis and go back to retransplantation. We must also understand that in the kind of patients that we see, patients who have got low urinary tract anomalies, this data is from St. John's, so I'm thankful to the nephrology team for having shared it. So when you look at these two lines of data, so this line of data are patients who have got normal lower urinary tract and they have been transplanted for medical reasons. This column is patients who have been transplanted for structural anomalies of the lower urinary tract, valves, neurogenic bladder, etc. As you can see, the number of UTIs are much higher in patients with low urinary tract anomalies, significantly different. Similarly, mortality is also higher in children with low urinary tract anomalies as compared to those transplanted for medical renal disease. Again, significant number of significant difference. So basically, children with low urinary tract anomalies are a high risk population to transplant. So these should not be taken casually. And we should do whatever it is that we can do to reduce the risk of recurrent UTIs and also reduce mortality in these patients. So these are a different group of patients and they have to be handled differently than a routine patient who's transplanted for a glomerulonephritis or some such thing. Suggesting the same thing. Basically, the graft survival and the patient survival are poorer in patients who have been transplanted for CACUT as compared to those who are transplanted for medical diseases. Right. Now we move on briefly to pediatric intestinal transplantation. Again, there are questions that were sent. I think it has come. What are the indications? The indications are short gut syndrome, commonest one being gastroschisis, about 20-25%. The next being midgut volvulus, about 16%. Multiple atrasias, 4%. Necrotizing enterocolitis, 14%. So these are the common indications. About 80% of transplants of intestine are done for short gut syndrome because of structural problems in the intestine, either volvulus, gangrene, necrotizing enterocolitis, gastroschisis, etc. About 20% are done for motility disorders. For example, pseudo obstruction, etc., etc. These are rare conditions, and these are what so total intestinal Hirschman's disease, for example, becomes an indication to transplant these two. That's about 20%, 18%. About 10% of transplants are done as retransplantation because the intestine again is an organ that does not last very long as compared to the liver. So these are the indications. So about 80% are because of surgical causes, about 20% are because of motility disorders, and a few for intestinal retransplantation after previous transplantation. Now, intestinal transplantation, when we say, is our concept is that you take a segment of intestine based on its arterial and blood supply in the mesentery, and you plumb it into the superior mesenteric artery and the superior mesenteric vein in the donor. So this is an isolated intestinal transplantation. This is what we commonly will think when we think about intestinal transplant. So you join the proximal end to the jejunum beyond the ligament of Treats, and then you join the distal end to the left colon because all the rest of the bowel is gone away. You leave a stoma so that you can do scopies and do multiple biopsies because you have to follow up these patients with multiple biopsies. And usually you end up putting a feeding port so these children can be fed over a period of time. So this is the standard intestinal only transplantation. But this does not give the best results. And often when patients are transplanted for the intestine, they have other problems as well. Because by the time this child has come to transplantation, he has remained on TPN for months and years. And during that time, his liver also has got damaged. So oftentimes, the transplantation of the intestine is combined with the liver. So you harvest it in a way that you get the liver with its blood vessels and the intestine with its blood vessels. So you take a patch of the aorta with the supraepicentric and the celiac axis on a patch, and that is joined to the native aorta, and you provide venous drainage via the portal vein. So this is how the intestine plus liver transplantation is done. And there are multiple variations for this. In some patients, you can also do what is called a multi-organ or multi-visceral transplant, wherein you do intestine, pancreas, duodenum, liver, IVC, and the works, part of the stomach as well. So there are multiple variations of intestinal transplantation, and these variations will depend upon what you have got inside the abdomen. For example, if you have an NEC child where everything is gone, you might have to replace everything. So that's how it works. So it depends on the anatomy that exists within the donor, the recipient, and what it is that that particular person requires. Obviously, as you go from A to this side, the complexity of the procedure increases, the complication rates increase, and everything else increases. There is a role for living donor intestinal transplant also, and you could harvest about 100-150 centimeters of intestine from a healthy donor, and leave terminal ileum behind, leave jejunum behind, and take the mid segment of the intestine with its blood vessel and transplant it into another person. And this is also well documented, though not a very popular procedure. Now, again, the intestine is a very large receptacle that contains large number of bacteria, and it is impossible to sterilize that bacteria before transplant. So you are going to shift this intestine with all its bacteria to an immunosuppressed patient. So because of that, the complication rates are higher. The intestine also has a large number of lymphatic tissue because of all the follicles that are inside, and this can also cause what is called a graft versus host reaction. So that means the lymphocytes in the graft go and attack the host, and this is called GVHD. So these are special problems that are seen in patients with intestinal transplantation, and that's why intestinal transplantation is a more difficult procedure to do with relatively less survival. As you can see, 1 year and 5 year graft survivals are in the range of about 50% to 60%. So it is not a very, very robust transplantation, but over time, results are gradually improving. So again, the immunosuppression is the same. You monitor with endoscopic biopsies, but a lot of these patients will require TPN for long periods of time before they can get on to full enteral feeding. Complications are common. Infections are the most common, GVHD, as I told you, but still, quality of life is better than those on TPN, but still is far less than optimal. So there's a lot here to go, and that is why there are so many variations in techniques that are being tried out. Lung transplantation is the other one that for some reason there are questions in your question paper. The lung again can be done either as an isolated lung transplant where you transplant only both the lungs, or you do a lung and heart transplant together. For example, if you have a child with VSD with Eisenmenger complex, the child has a cardiac disease and has a pulmonary disease, so you do a combined lung heart transplant. If the heart itself is normal and you have a primary lung disease, for example, cystic fibrosis, you do only a lung transplantation. So what are the indications for lung transplantation? So this lists it in the form of indications as per age. So in children, in infants, they are basically surfactant protein deficiencies. Children with significant congenital heart disease and lung disease, where they will require to have a combined heart and lung transplantation. And idiopathic pulmonary artery hypertension. So this is not a condition we understand very well. It is seen across the age groups. So there is no cause, but the pulmonary artery pressure is very high. So it is seen from infancy all the way to adulthood. And we do not know what the reason is, but this becomes a common indication to transplant across the age groups. As you come to older children, cystic fibrosis becomes an important reason to transplant. This also, as cystic fibrosis programs across the world have improved, medical care has improved, the risks have improved, and relatively fewer children are requiring transplantation, and that too little later in life as compared to early in life. So common indications for lung transplant would be cystic fibrosis, idiopathic pulmonary artery hypertension, and interstitial pulmonary fibrosis. For reasons, again, these are diseases that are not clearly understood. So these are the indications for lung transplantation. So again, the donor criteria have to be important because most of these are cadaveric donors, and because of that, you have to ensure that that lung is going to work, and the lung is a very fragile structure, and if it doesn't work when you put it into the patient is going to die, because you can keep the patient on ECMO for a short period, but beyond that, if the lung function doesn't pick up, that patient is going to die. So there are very stringent criteria about selecting various criteria about how to select a donor for transplantation. Essentially, they should have good gas exchange, they should have relatively low ventilatory pressures, the ischemia time should be low, and they should be size matched. So for an adult, the height of the donor and the recipient should be within this range. So if in a child, you look at the height, the length of the child, and predicted lung capacity, and within 20% you have to transfer. So you can't put too big an organ into the thoracic cavity, whether it is lung or heart, because the thoracic cage is a closed cavity, unlike the abdomen. So again, the technique is they do a big transverse thoracotomy. That means from one anterior axillary, mid axillary line to the other side, and you open the chest as a clamshell. You do usually the thing that is done. You do one lung at a time. You first take out the worst lung while the other lung is being ventilated. you transplant this lung, then you ventilate this lung, and then transplant the other lung. So when you do that, you avoid cardiopulmonary bypass. The bugbear of lung transplantation is the bronchial anastomosis, because the bronchial blood supply is tenuous, and in transplantation is even more tenuous. So there are various techniques that have been described. So currently that is recommended is a telescoping technique, where you put one over the other and anastomose rather than an end-to-end anastomosis. So usually you do the bronchus first and then the artery and vein in sequence. Potentially do living donor lung transplant. So you need two donors, both of them give their lower lobes, and you can transplant it into one patient. So again, these are all bordering on extreme measures, but these are all technically feasible and they have been done. Again, the outcomes in lung transplantation are not as good as kidney and liver. They are about the same as compared to the intestine. So you have about 50% of loss by the time the child is 5 or 6 years. So if you look at the average survival after lung transplant, if the transplant is done, in less than 1 year, it is about 6.4. So basically, usually it lasts for about 5 to 6 years or 6 to 7 years. So that is the average lifespan of a transplanted lung. What are the complications? Again, hyperacute rejection is common in lungs even today. Pulmonary edema, TRALI, that is transfusion associated lung injury, bronchial leaks are all common, and a lot of these sometimes can turn out to be very difficult to manage. Infections are common because, again, the lung is an organ that has a lot of bacteria and viruses in it. These are transplanted along with the lung in an immunosuppressed patient, and you can get assorted infections. One of the bugbear of lung transplantation is what is called bronchiolitis obliterans, and this is thought to be an effect of chronic rejection, where over time the bronchi all seem to disappear. It is like a biliary hypoplasia. You have less and less bile ducts. Similarly, you have less and less bronchi, and the lung cannot ventilate, and the patient suffers because of that. And that's the common reason why a lot of these lung transplant patients suffer over time, despite there being no major acute problem after transplant. Right. So that is about the organ specific transplants, about the general aspects of transplantation, some about the organ specific transplantation. Now, few things we should remember when we talk about transplantation in children. Now, these children are special children because you really cannot cure them. Even after you transplant them, they are going to be on immunosuppression, and because of that immunosuppression, they are going to have multiple problems. So you have taken away one problem, which is of the organ failure, and given them another problem, which is related to immunosuppression medications and its side effects. You hope that the immunosuppression medicine side effects and things are something that you can manage. So you are converting a life-threatening disease to a chronic disease. For example, you are converting somebody who has got cancer to effectively that is what it is you are doing. So you are giving somebody a chronic disease for which the child requires to have lifelong medical therapy. So as long as you are taking your medicines properly, as long as you control your lifestyle, as long as you control your diet activity, you will function normally, like anybody with diabetes, for example. So you're changing this child from a life-threatening disease to another chronic disease, and this is something we should remember, and that commitment has to be there. So it is not do the transplant and send them home. So there is a lifelong burden. A lot of these patients require retransplantation. A lot of these patients are very sick with chronic disease before that. So this child is a special child and requires a lot of care from a lot of specialists to get it through. It is not just the operation. Drug toxicity is again a very, very serious issue, and I've been speaking to this, I've been repeating this multiple times over the presentation. Adverse effects of immune suppression is something that we cannot underplay, and all these families should understand. PTLD is basically, transplant is basically tumors that come into patients who have got immunosuppression. So these are commonly lymphomas, for example, and these lymphomas and these medications have to be treated, and because the immune system, when it is suppressed, you can get malignancies, and the commonest malignancy that we see are lymphomas. You can get metabolic syndrome. So a lot of these patients have poor sugar maintenance. They are obese. They have blood pressure. So these are things that we have to look after. Lot of these immunosuppression medicines cause kidney injury, so renal dysfunction. So all these conditions are lifelong risks which we have to continue to monitor. Infection risks remains. The early part of the operation, after the early part of the operation, in the first few weeks, bacterial infections are common. But over time, you can get multiple viral infections with cytomegalovirus, Epstein-Barr virus, infections perhaps. And these are things that we have to continue to manage. In addition to that, they will get the usual malaria, dengue, everything else. And we have to keep looking after these children lifelong. And because of all these problems, they do require extra support, both physically and psychologically. But you must understand that in these patients, in the available options, transplantation gives them the best chance of near normal existence. So today, transplantation is standard of care for end-stage organ failure. It is the best option for optimal long-term survival and quality of life. It is by no means ideal. In fact, in some organs, it is far from ideal. But perhaps today, it is the best option that is available. The holy grail is that you do one transplant and that organ lasts you for life. So for some reason, if you develop biliary atresia, the baby gets one transplant and that transplant lasts the child for life. And that phenomenon is what is called immune tolerance. So you modify the host in a way that it accepts the graft as its own tissue. And once you achieve that, you achieve what is called immune tolerance. And once you achieve immunotolerance, potentially you can take off immunosuppression and you have taken away all the side effects of immunosuppression, and you have one liver that lasts for life. That is the holy grail. So in many organs, we are still very, very far away from. So problems will persist, which are related to immune-mediated chronic rejection and adverse effects of lifelong immunosuppression. As I told you, achieving immune tolerance is the holy grail, and there are multiple groups of people around the world who are trying to work on this. Advances in tissue engineering and regenerative medicine are very exciting because potentially, if you can generate organs in laboratories, you can modify their antigenic structure in such a way that your body, the immune system, does not react to them as aggressively as it does with other organs from humans. So these are things that are for the future, and we hope that over time these things will all come into routine practice. So I will stop here. I'll just a couple of these are the questions that were sent to me. I think indications for liver transplant that is covered. Steps of extended portoenterostomy. I don't know whether you want to talk about it here. We'll come back to this if you require. Selection of liver donor. Any live donor, as I told you, has to be healthy. So for liver donor, if it's a live donor, by law, as per our Transplantation of Human Organs Act, it has to be a relative. Now, relative by law is parents, grandparents, siblings, children, grandchildren. Now, because our patients are children, there is no children, grandchildren, siblings who can be donors. So it could either be parents or grandparents. In our practice, about 80-85% of the time, it is one of the parents who have donated. Of this, about 2/3 are mothers, 1/3 are fathers. So the donor has to have a same or compatible blood group. So if you have a recipient who's A positive, your donor could be either A positive or O positive. So it has to be a compatible or similar blood group. All right. So it has to be a patient who is an immediate relative. They have to be in reasonable age. You don't want somebody who's 80 years old with multiple comorbidities. So most of the time, the cutoff is about 55, 60 years old. Again, it depends upon the comorbid. You might have somebody who's 35-year-old but is tremendously obese. You can't take them. You might have somebody who's 60 years old but is otherwise fundamentally well. You could take them. So age is basically a rough guide. They should be physically healthy. They should not have any significant comorbidities, uncontrolled blood pressure, uncontrolled diabetes, obesity. All these things should not be there. Blood group should be similar or compatible. If all this is done, then you look at the anatomy. So you look at the anatomy by doing contrast CTs to make sure that the liver is not fatty. It should contain less than 5% fat, and the vascular anatomy, especially of the portal vein, the hepatic artery, and the ducts, should be such that you can harvest a part of the liver along with proper vessels that you can join in the recipient. All right, so you should be able to harvest maybe say left lateral segment or left lobe safely without compromising the remaining liver in the donor. And the graft that you take out, you must have good enough vessels to put it into the recipient. So these are the selection principles for a person who is for a liver donor. All right. When it is a cadaveric donor, again, it has to be same blood group or compatible blood group. The cadaveric donor's liver function test should be near normal. There should be no pre-existing history of liver disease. They should not be on any hepatotoxic drug. They should not be alcoholic. The liver should not be fatty. And once you have all this, they could be used as a liver donor. Current status of small bowel and lung transplantation I covered. Liver transplant under indications, assessment, advances, surgical technique, all this I mentioned. Factors, good prognosis, Kasai portoenterostomy, we'll skip for now. Indications of liver transplantation in pediatric age group I mentioned. Current status and recommendation of liver transplant in EHPA. Right. Now, even today in the current status for extrahepatic biliary atresia or sort of biliary atresia, the primary treatment is a Kasai portoenterostomy. So if you have a child who comes to you at the correct time, at the correct age, with reasonable liver function and good quality liver, the first step is always a Kasai portoenterostomy. However, you must remember, if the liver is damaged, if the liver is cirrhotic at presentation, or the patient is having uncorrectable clotting, so that you have a prolonged PT-INR, but you give FFP and still it does not correct. Or sorry, you give vitamin K and it still does not correct. That means the liver has very little reserve. You image the liver, it looks all fibrotic and very hard and nodular. That child has got cirrhosis, and that cirrhotic liver is not going to do well when you do a Kasai portoenterostomy on that child. So if you have a child who's ideal, maybe less than 60 days, maybe up to 90 days, but the liver is good quality, no other comorbidities, the first step is always a Kasai portoenterostomy. When you have Kasai portoenterostomy failure, that means after 2 months, the liver functions have not improved. That is defined as a failure of portoenterostomy. These patients have to be referred for liver transplantation. The liver transplantation is not going to be done at 2 months, but it will give us time to work through all those things that we discussed earlier. If after Kasai portoenterostomy, later on, maybe at 3 years, 4 years, child gets recurrent cholangitis and has progressive deterioration in liver function, develops evidence of liver dysfunction, for example, ascites, develops portal hypertension, hematemesis, this becomes the indication for transplantation in those patients. Another indication for transplantation is if you are developing hepatopulmonary syndrome, and that is marked by a child developing clubbing, a child developing low saturations on room air, and these are indications that this child is developing hepatopulmonary syndrome. And if you are developing hepatopulmonary syndrome, it becomes an indication to transplant even if the liver functions are normal. Please remember. All right. So these are indications of liver transplantation in biliary atresia. Plus, so either you get a patient who is beyond Kasai, or after Kasai, I mentioned to you the various indications. I think hepatoblastoma, pretext staging, etc., is out of our scope today. Common indications of liver transplantation in children with hepatoblastoma. So basically, it requires to be unresectable. So either a multifocal hepatoblastoma, or a pretext for hepatoblastoma, or a hepatoblastoma wherein there is an involvement of the central segment. So in the portal vein or the hepatic artery, the confluence is abnormal and you cannot do a proper hepatectomy. They become indications for liver transplantation when you have hepatoblastoma. But one of the important issue is you should not have untreated extrahepatic disease. In other words, you should not have metastasis that you cannot treat. If you have a solitary lung nodule, you could probably do metastasectomy and still go ahead with transplantation. But if you have distant multiple metastasis here and there, that becomes a contraindication to liver transplantation in hepatoblastoma. So basically, multifocal hepatoblastoma, pretext for hepatoblastoma become indications. Or even if it is pretext 3, when it is central, where you have problems with the confluence of the hepatic artery and the portal vein, and you are not able to resect without compromising the remnant lobe, they become indications for liver transplantation in hepatoblastoma. Drugs used in immunosuppression in children I mentioned, and the other things also we mentioned. So I will stop here and I'm happy to take any questions.
Sanjay, needless to say, it is an outstanding and a brilliant presentation. The only analogy I can give to my admiration to you is the COVID numbers in Bangalore. Every day it increases. Every it goes down.
No. See, COVID comparisons are dangerous comparisons, Ramesh.
No. Forget about the exam going. I think it has a extremely useful presentation for lots of us. In fact, you got some admirers in Ravikaran, Gopal Pingali, Ramchandra, a lot of other people also coming, not necessarily exam goers, but I'm sure it with everybody.
Can I say something, Ramesh?
Yes, please, Gopal, tell me.
Yeah, I mean, most of the things which Sanjay was mentioning was probably quite irrelevant to me as a practitioner in a town. But the sheer joy of listening to Sanjay Rao was so exhilarating that, like, even if he throws abuses, it's just so much good to listen to him. Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you.
Thanks, Gopal. You can't see my ears turning red with embarrassment. Anyway, thank you very much, Gopal.
Anyway, Sanjay, it is brilliant because it covered everything that a student could have asked for, and you put it in such an explicit manner and a very remembering. It's very easy to remember. Very, very easy to remember the way you put it. A few general questions. One, you did mention about domino transplant. What exactly you mean? Can you just elaborate a little on the concept?
Yeah. So, see, there are certain metabolic diseases wherein, for example, if you have Wilson's disease, you have ceruloplasmin deficiency, and that's primary liver disease. So that enzyme is, secreted in the liver, and you have a genetic defect because of which, the liver doesn't secrete ceruloplasmin, and there is no other source of that particular enzyme. All right. So that patient requires a liver transplant, and when you do the liver transplant, the Wilson's disease is fixed. So that is a enzyme. So that's a single source enzyme, all right, only from the liver. Sometimes what you have is you have a situation wherein you have some diseases like, for example, maple syrup urine disease, etc., wherein these enzymes have two sources. So one of the source is the liver, but the enzyme is also coming from another source in the body. It's not only from the liver. So there is a other source of this enzyme. So when you have a situation like this, so though so this particular liver from this patient, say for example, you have a child, suppose you have a child who has got maple syrup urine disease, and you need to transplant that child. You could, and there is another child who has, I'm just trying to make the sequence for you. Say for example, you have somebody who has got biliary atresia, and somebody who has, you can basically take a liver from this child who has got this metabolic abnormality and use it in the patient with biliary atresia, and you can take another liver and use it in the child with this maple syrup urine disease. So, for example, what is happening is you are harvesting only one patient's liver, but you're getting two transplantations. So, the liver that is coming from this metabolic disease patient can be used in another person, because in that person, that liver will function properly because there is another source of the enzyme. For example, if you have maple syrup urine disease, you don't have the enzyme at all. Neither is your liver producing it, nor is your peripheral tissue producing it. Right?
Okay.
If you have biliary atresia, your liver is damaged, but it is not producing the particular enzyme, but its systemic supply is still going on. So you don't suffer from that metabolic disease.
Okay.
So you can use this liver that is coming from this child who has the enzymatic defect and put it in somebody who does not have the enzymatic defect. Because though this liver is not making the enzyme, other tissues are making the enzyme. I don't know whether I'm clear.
No, it's fairly clear.
Yeah. So there's one donor giving part of the liver. That liver goes to the child with maple syrup urine disease, and the liver from the child with maple syrup urine disease goes to somebody with biliary atresia. So that is like a domino.
Well, I got it. So basically, it's like an exchange transplantation.
It's like the other phenomenon, what is called a swap. So swap is basically there are two donors and two recipients, but they are giving to one another.
Okay.
So this is not a swap. This is one donor, but you're doing two transplants. So that's why it's a domino. You knock one coin and two other coins go forward.
Okay. Next thing I wanted to ask you was, in a small bowel transplant, I was always wondering what happens to the chyle which is secreted. I thought the chyle also plays an important part in the digestion and the small bowel function.
Yeah. So you don't do any chylous anastomosis. So one of the complications, common frequent complications in children with intestinal transplantation is, chylous ascites, and you don't usually do any definitive lymphatic. So what they insist is basically to close everything with stitches. So when you take the mesentery, close the edge of the mesentery with stitches. You shell all the vessels correctly, so you don't have loose leaking lymphatics.
Okay.
The new lymphatics will eventually form, but until such time, if you have areas of tissue that are not properly controlled, you can have chylous ascites. It is a known problem with intestinal transplant, but over time it does get better. And that's one of the reasons I told you that a lot of these children will continue to require TPN for prolonged periods of time even after the transplant.
I had attended one lecture by Dr. Anil Vajja, small bowel transplant from Chennai. He had also mentioned that they generally also harvest a part of the skin and perhaps myocutaneous flap, put it on the recipient, so that acts as an early indicator of a rejection inside, because it shares the same antigens. I mean, any thoughts or any things about that?
I have personal experience with intestinal transplant. Whatever I have done, whatever I know is what I have seen here and there and read. So most of these patients will have a stoma.
Okay.
And they will biopsy from the stoma.
Okay.
So you keep doing endoscopies through the stoma and take multiple biopsies. So that is what is usually done in most children.
Okay.
If you
And,
look at the outcomes, I showed all of them had stoma.
Okay,
They are not
excellent.
stomas, but there is a stoma.
I saw it's just like a access loop that we used to do. For example, even in the olden days with biliary atresia, also we used to do that. Remember?
Correct. Yes.
Finally, we get. Thank you, Sanjay. In fact, before I go further, first priority is for the exam going PGs. Any questions or any comments? Because I think he put it so lucidly. If you have a comment, Jagdish, Sridhar.
Sir, no, sir.
No, sir.
It's fine, sir.
Sir, Ravikiran here. Sir, one question.
Sir, thanks.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sanjay. Yeah. Sir, normally we say in post-Kasai, in biliary atresia, we say the failure or past success is assessed till after 6 months post-op. So you're saying by 2 months you just declare its failure and go. Isn't it too early? That's what.
No, it is. See, I think by most of us, I think 6 months is too long a time. So whether your Kasai is going to, so we in our practice, and I think what is written in most instances is you define whether your Kasai is successful or not at the end of 2 months. So if at the end of 2 months your liver function is back to normal,
Okay.
your Kasai is successful. So the patient should be acolic, should not be jaundice at the end of 2 months after Kasai operation. So you can ask that we started with 10 bilirubin, now it has come to 6.5 at the end of 2 months. So what, is it successful or not successful? So in that instance, you give it some more time. But you must understand that when this kind of a thing happens, it is likely that this patient is going to land in that middle category where you have part success but not complete success. And these patients also will start to have major complications during the first few months or first few years of their life. So they have to be looked after early. I'm not suggesting that they need transplantation. I'm just suggesting that if there is no clearance of jaundice at the end of 2 months, then the potential risk that this child is going to need transplantation is very high.
Okay.
If in the 3rd month the child has jaundice, that's fine, excellent. But that does not happen that commonly.
Okay. And how early, what is the youngest age you do transplant in children, sir, for liver?
So liver transplantation, theoretically, there are indications where you can do them in neonates. For example, Rela has a large experience of doing them in neonates who are 1 or 2, 3 years old. And this is basically for the congenital hemochromatosis, which is now called phagocytic syndrome. So these patients require transplant very early. So he has got a small number of patients that early. So theoretically, it is possible. Our youngest patient that we have done here is about 4 months old, about 3.5 kgs.
Okay.
For Kasai, for biliary atresia, corrected, usually they require transplantation around the first year, 7 to 8 months. If they have not had Kasai, or if they have had Kasai which has not worked, so usually within the first year.
Okay. Right. Thank you, sir.
Ravi, to answer your question about biliary atresia, what we generally tell is, I agree with what Sanjay is saying. It's not that we declare that it is a failure, but at the end of 2 months, the child is not well, and if the liver functions are not normalized, if the child is not ecolic, definitely we will alert them to be on at least the liver transplant registry. At least they go meet them, come back. Because by the time they get enrolled, they get treated, by the time they really go into that, at least it gives them a lot of time for them to be prepared in case a transplant is required. 1. 2, I invite hepatologists right from the word go. Our gastroenterologists, at least, we start seeing the patient pre-operatively and right from the post-op for every visit that they make to us. I make it a point to go and see them so that in case they can pick up the liver failure at the earliest or not improvement at the earliest and potential transplants can be taken up.
Okay, right. Thank you.
Ramchandra sir or any other staff, Murli, Vinay, Venkatesh, Deepak, I see a lot of them. Ramchandra sir?
Sanjay, that was a really enjoyable and highly educational lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
In case Sridhar, Venkatesh or exam going PGs or any other PGs, if you have any questions, please ask. The master is around.
Sir, thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you. All right, Ramesh.
Okay, Sanjay, time for saying a vote of thanks and as usual, very, very heartfelt thanks because you came at such a short notice and made it all simple, clear and very lucid. Thank you very much, Sanjay. Really appreciate for all your efforts and all your time. Thank you. We will be looking forward to your participation again in future.
Sure.
Sanjay,
Thanks very much.
Last but not the least, we are likely to have our MCH exams and DNB, MCA inspection somewhere in first or second week of September. There is not clarity about the physicality of the exams.
Okay.
But I think I gathered since there is an MC inspection along with it, they seem to be keen on conducting a physical exams.
Okay.
So we're trying our level best in cases, but again, in case we have some support, some shortage, we maybe will be getting in touch with you.
Okay. All right.
Just in case.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ramesh. Thank you. Bye-bye.